All right, everyone, welcome back. Let's jump right into our next deep dive. This time, we're looking at this local Kansas City radio show. It's a podcast, too, actually. It's called Past Week, Next Week. I think you guys are really going to love this one. It's got like a little bit of everything, news, sports, entertainment, all that good stuff. They don't hold back on their opinions either.
That's what makes these local sources so fascinating, right? You get this really unique perspective on how people are experiencing the world and like their reactions to all the big events and cultural moments and all that.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of big events, we got to start with the Chiefs. Man, that AFC Championship game against the Bills.
Yeah.
Talk about a nail biter. But they pulled it off. And now they're heading to the Super Bowl again. They could actually win 3 in a row.
It's incredible, right? First team to ever go back-to-back and then head straight back for a three-peat. And the way they just shut down the Bills' running game in the second half, it was like they just flipped a switch and adapted to the situation perfectly. It's clear they were the more adaptable team that day.
That's what's kind of making me nervous about this Super Bowl matchup against the Eagles, though. If the Chiefs had trouble containing James Cook, what are they going to do with Saquon Barkley? That guy's a beast.
He is a force to be reckoned with, that's for sure. But, I don't think the Eagles are going to rely on Barkley alone. I mean, think about it. A good offensive coordinator is going to try to keep the Chiefs guessing. So they might focus on the passing game or use Saquon Barkley in ways we haven't seen before. We'll see how the Chiefs adapt to that if they can adapt.
True. It's funny. I've been hearing some pretty crazy stuff about the Chiefs lately. Some people, even sports analysts like Nick Wright, are going around saying that it's all rigged, like the refs are biased towards the Chiefs and they're getting all the calls. And it's like, are we living in a world of conspiracy theories now? Thanks, social media.
It's definitely something to think about, how social media shapes our perceptions. You can get caught up in these echo chambers where everyone's just reinforcing the same ideas. Whether those ideas are accurate or not is a different story. So it's really important to take a step back, and critically evaluate the information you're getting, especially when it comes to something as passionate as sports.
No, you're absolutely right. Well, I'm not buying any Chiefs Super Bowl merch until they actually win the darn thing. But speaking of big events, we've got the Grammys coming up, too. I'm excited, but got to be honest, some of these nominees, I've never even heard of them.
Well, that's part of the fun of these deep dives, right? Always something new to discover. One of the biggest awards at the Grammys is Best New Artist. That's where they recognize the, up-and-coming talent who had a breakout year. And this year, we've got some interesting contenders. We've got Chappell Roan, who's actually from Missouri Pride, and pop star Sabrina Carpenter, and a few others.
Oh, yeah. Missouri Pride for Chappell Roan. I got to check her music out. Okay, now this is going to be controversial. Beyonce's album, Cowboy Carter. I'm just not feeling it. Not this time.
And that's totally fine. Everyone's got their own taste. And the thing about the Grammys is they actually have separate awards for Record of the Year and Song of the Year, which is interesting. So Record of the Year is about the overall sound and production, the whole package, whereas Song of the Year focuses specifically on the songwriting itself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And speaking of songwriting legends, some of these nominees, I got to say, they just don't hold a candle to artists like Taylor Swift or the Beatles. Not even close. What makes an artist truly legendary?
It's a great question. What really contributes to an artist's longevity and impact, Is it pure talent? Or is it more about their marketing or their cultural relevance or maybe a mix of all those things? It's something to think about as you're listening to music and what really makes it stand the test of time.
I like that. Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the political side of things. So the Past Week, Next Week hosts were pretty critical of some of former President Trump's policies. They did not hold back.
Yeah, they were particularly concerned about the effects of his decisions on healthcare and the federal government, specifically cuts to programs like Medicaid and the downsizing of the federal workforce. They argued that those things had some really negative consequences.
And I got to say, I agree with them on the whole social media and politics thing.
Yeah.
It seems like it's just become this breeding ground for misinformation, which is just adding to all the division in society. What do you think about that?
Well, it ties back to what we were talking about earlier, about the Chiefs and the conspiracy theories. Like there's this trend of distrust growing in institutions and this tendency to believe whatever confirms our biases, no matter how crazy it sounds. Scary stuff.
You're telling me the radio hosts were really stressing the need for unity and action within the Democratic Party, saying that they need to present a united front to counter the current political climate. What did they have to say about that?
They really emphasized the need for informed engagement and being active in the political process. They said it's not enough to just complain on social media. You got to get out there and actually do something, whether that's voting, volunteering, or just contacting your representatives and letting them know what you think.
Absolutely. So beyond the Super Bowl, the Grammys and all the political talk, they touched on a few other interesting things. Like, did you hear about the NBA trade with Luka Doncic?
Yeah, it was a big shakeup for the league,
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what the teams are thinking, what their long-term strategies are, and only time will tell how it'll play out for them.
Then there was this news about this new pain medication that just got approved by the FDA. It's supposed to be a total game changer. Like, it actually prevents pain signals instead of just masking the pain like opioids do,
Wow.
right?
Yeah, it's called suturing, and it's definitely a big deal, potentially a huge step forward in how we manage pain, especially since it could offer an alternative to opioids, which, let's be real, have caused so many problems with addiction and all that. The fact that it actually targets the pain at its source, that's pretty remarkable.
It almost sounds too good to be true. What do you think? Is it going to live up to the hype?
Well, I think we got to be cautiously optimistic. The FDA has these really strict approval processes, so it's definitely promising. But we need to see how it actually works out there in the real world before we get too excited.
Fingers crossed. Okay, this one blew my mind. A massive sinkhole just opened up in Japan,
Oh,
and they're still trying to rescue this truck driver who got swallowed up by it. Yikes.
it's a crazy story. It really makes you think about how fragile our infrastructure can be. And the fact that they're saying it might have been caused by old sewer pipes, it just highlights the importance of maintaining and updating our systems, right? You got to keep things safe.
You know, I'm never going to look at a storm drain the same way again.
Yeah.
And then there's this. Toilet paper shoppers in Japan now have a new option. Rolls made from recycled diapers. I can't even...
Uh-huh. Well, that's definitely different. But I guess it shows how creative we're getting with finding sustainable solutions. We got to do something about resource scarcity, and this is definitely a unique approach, even if it's a little weird. Imagine the marketing for that one, though.
Oh, man, I know, right? It's like, not so fresh, but hey, it's sustainable.
Haha, exactly.
Okay, so this whole deep dive thing,
Yeah.
it's pretty amazing, right? Like, it's AI generated taking all these conversations and trying to make sense of them.
It is pretty impressive the way it can synthesize information and find those connections.
But sometimes I gotta say, it gets things a little wrong, especially when it comes to humor. It's like
Oh.
it doesn't quite get sarcasm or irony.
AI is still evolving, right?
Yeah.
It's one of the biggest challenges, teaching it to understand the nuances of human language, especially humor, which is often so context dependent.
And this is where it gets really weird. It started attributing MY puns to itself. Like the ones I'm clearly reading from a book, it's trying to take credit for them. It's stealing my thunder.
It seems like it's not quite there yet in terms of being able to distinguish between, original content and something that's being sourced from somewhere else. But it's a good reminder that human creativity is still something special. It's something AI can't replicate, at least not yet.
Exactly. Okay, now back to the news. Did you see that one of Trump's big promises, that whole reducing the size of the federal government thing, seems to have actually come true? The past week, next week, hosts were talking about this plane crash at Reagan National and how staffing shortages in the air traffic control tower might have been a factor. And they were saying that these shortages were potentially a result of budget cuts and hiring freezes under Trump. Scary, right?
Yeah, that's a pretty serious allegation. If it's true, it really raises concerns about the effects of cutting back on these essential government services, especially those that directly impact public safety.
And what's even worse, Trump immediately started deflecting blame, saying the crash was somehow the fault of diversity and inclusion hiring practices within the FAA. Like, really?
His comments were definitely controversial and to many deeply troubling. It seemed like he was trying to use this tragedy to push a divisive agenda, which is never a good look.
It's classic Trump, isn't it? Find a scapegoat and distract from his own potential failures. And what's scary is it seems to work for some people. They just eat it up.
It speaks to the power of misinformation and the erosion of trust we've been talking about. When people don't trust institutions or the media, they're more likely to believe anything that fits their worldview, even if it's not true.
So true. The radio host made a good point, though. It's not enough to just complain on social media. We have to actually do something, right?
Right. They argued that the Democratic Party needs to find a strong leader, someone who can unite the party and present a clear alternative to the current political climate. And they even threw out some names: Gavin Newsom, Pete Buttigieg. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
I'm curious, what else really stood out to you from past week, next week? Anything else we should dive into?
One thing that really resonated with me was their discussion about the dangers of falling into a cult-like mentality when it comes to political figures. They were drawing a parallel between Trump's unwavering support among his base and the kind of blind obedience you see in, authoritarian regimes. It's scary how social media echo chambers and constant reinforcement of biased information can shut down critical thinking and make people so resistant to facts.
Yeah, I think about that quote, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it.
Mm.
And it's not just about politics anymore, it's happening everywhere. Conspiracy theories about everything, vaccines, the moon landing. It's wild.
It's what some people call truth decay, where objective facts are less important than what people want to believe. It's a dangerous trend, and it makes having real conversations and making informed decisions so much harder.
Totally. Okay, enough doom and gloom for now. They had this news quiz segment on Past Week, Next Week, and man, they were terrible at it. It was hilarious. All these wrong answers and tangents and just good-natured ribbing.
It's a good reminder, though, that it's important to stay informed about what's going on in the world. It's easy to get caught up in our own little bubbles and lose sight of the bigger picture.
So what other interesting stuff did they dig up? Anything scandalous or gossipy?
They talked about this new Chinese startup called DeepSeek that's making waves in the tech world with their cheap AI assistant.
Wow, really? I wonder if that's the same AI that's powering our deep dive segments. Maybe that's why it's so budget friendly.
You never know. The whole field of AI is moving so fast. What used to be cutting edge is now, well, affordable and accessible.
It's kind of exciting, but also kind of scary, right? What happens when AI can write better jokes than I can? I might be out of a job.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a place for human creativity and wit.
Okay, good. So what else did they cover?
They mentioned this pretty scathing letter that Caroline Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy's daughter, sent to members of the Senate denouncing her cousin, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as a dangerous opportunist who's just profiting off the anti-vaccine movement.
Whoa, really? That's a pretty serious accusation, especially coming from family. What did she say exactly?
She basically called him addicted to attention and power and accused him of preying on the desperation of parents and sick children. She thinks his whole platforming of anti-vaccine rhetoric is really hurting public health.
Yeah, it's not surprising. RFK Jr. has been pushing some really harmful and misleading information for years.
It's a reminder that we need to be critical of information, regardless of who's sharing it. Even if it's someone with a big name, we got to check the facts.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got AI on the rise, political drama, a sinkhole in Japan, diaper toilet paper.
Right.
What else is going to happen this week?
Well, the past week, next week, hosts ended their show with this segment called Headlines and Predictions, where they took real news stories and added their own funny punchlines. It's a fun way to lighten things up.
I love that. It's like everyone can get in on the joke. What were some of their headlines?
They started with a story about the recovery efforts after that plane crash in the Potomac. Their punchline was, or we could just take the crass co-president at his word and blame Biden, Mayo Pete, and DEI.
Oof. That's a dark one. But yeah, it kind of reflects the current political climate, doesn't it? Everything's a partisan battle these days.
Then they moved on to a story about Trump's cabinet picks facing tough questions during their Senate confirmation hearings. Their punchline was, Vice President J.D. Vance expressed confidence that the three nominees will ultimately be confirmed because he knows that Putin will only make payments to Trump after the confirmation.
Conspiracy theories and corruption, all in one. Classic. What else?
They also had a bit of fun with a story about the FDA's approval of that new pain medication. Their punchline was, while saying they don't know exactly how yet, Big Pharma does indeed plan to find a way to make this drug addictive as well.
That's funny, but also kind of sad, right? Big Pharma doesn't exactly have the best track record when it comes to putting patients before profits.
And finally, they couldn't resist poking fun at that sinkhole incident in Japan. Their punchline was, after the first week of the Trump presidency, many Americans plan on joining that driver in the sinkhole in order to be safer.
I mean, can you blame them? Sometimes it feels like the world's gone completely crazy and the only sane response is to just hide underground, right? But hey, at least they'll have some recycled diaper toilet paper down there to keep them company.
Indeed. It seems like we're living in a time where absurdity and reality are constantly colliding.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this first part of our deep dive into Past Week, Next Week.
But before we do, I want to leave you with something to think about.
Oh, okay. Hit me with it.
So we're constantly bombarded with information these days, right? Conflicting stories, opinions flying around. It can be tough to know what to believe, So the question is, how do you cut through all the noise and decide what really matters? Like, how do you figure out what you actually believe?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it feels like it's getting harder and harder to answer.
Yeah.
I do like how the Past Week, Next Week guys tackled all these big topics, though. And they didn't shy away from the tough stuff, the politics, the misinformation, all that.
Yeah, they weren't afraid to get real, and I think that's what makes them so relatable. They're worried about the same things a lot of us are, the erosion of trust, the political polarization, but they also don't lose their sense of humor, which I think is so important.
Totally. You got to be able to laugh at the absurdity of it all, right?
Yeah.
So what else did they talk about that you found interesting?
Well, they mentioned this new Chinese startup called DeepSeek, and it's causing a stir because they've developed this AI assistant that's supposed to be super affordable.
Hold on, wait a minute. Isn't that what we're doing right now with this deep dive thing? Like AI-powered analysis and all that?
Maybe it's the same AI, who knows? What's crazy is how quickly this technology is evolving. What used to be super expensive and exclusive is now becoming accessible to everyone.
It is pretty mind-blowing. Then there was that whole Caroline Kennedy thing, writing that letter publicly criticizing her cousin, RFK Jr., for his involvement in the anti-vaccine movement. I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
It was a powerful statement, for sure. She called him out for spreading misinformation and profiting from people's fears, and it just goes to show we really have to be critical of what we're hearing, no matter who's saying it.
For sure. Blindly following anyone, no matter how famous or influential, that's dangerous territory. So what about their headlines and predictions segment? They had some good ones, right?
They did. Remember the one about the plane crash recovery efforts? Their punchline was, or we could just take the crass co-president at his word and blame Biden, Mayo Pete, and DEI.
Yeah. It's funny because it's true, right? It seems like every issue these days gets twisted into some kind of partisan battle.
Then they moved on to a story about Trump's cabinet picks facing scrutiny during those confirmation hearings. They joked that Vice President J.D. Vance was confident those nominees would be confirmed because Putin will only make payments to Trump after the confirmation.
Oh, man, those guys are savage. I love it.
They even had a joke about the new pain medication. They said, while saying they don't know exactly how yet, Big Pharma does indeed plan to find a way to make this drug addictive as well.
Cynical, but probably true, right? Sad but true. Big Pharma isn't exactly known for putting people before profits.
And last but not least, their punchline for the sinkhole story was, after the first week of the Trump presidency, many Americans plan on joining that driver in the sinkhole in order to be safer.
It's funny because it's dark, right? It really captures that feeling of just wanting to escape from all the craziness. But hey, at least you'd have some recycled diaper toilet paper down there to keep you company.
Exactly. Sometimes you got to find humor in the darkest of places, you know? It's what keeps us going.
So true. All right, well, that wraps up part 2 of our deep dive into past week, next week.
So we've talked about all this crazy stuff going on in the world, and it kind of makes you wonder, right? How do we even keep up with it all?
Seriously, it's like a fire hose of information these days. And not all of it's good, you know? It's easy to get sucked into the negativity and just feel overwhelmed. How do we even stay informed without losing our minds?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Finding a balance. I think it starts with being really aware of where you're getting your information from. Are you just reading the same sources all the time? Or are you branching out and getting different perspectives?
I think that's a good point. It's so easy to get stuck in that echo chamber, just hearing the same opinions over and over again. And before you know it, you've lost touch with what other people are thinking.
And then it becomes harder to understand each other, right? To have those, productive conversations where you actually learn something new. So try to seek out different voices, even those you might not agree with. It's eye-opening.
Yeah, totally. It's like challenge yourself a little bit. It's not just about where we get our information from, though. It's also about how we actually consume it. Like, are we just passively scrolling through our feeds? Or are we really thinking critically about what we're reading?
Exactly. Don't just take everything at face value. Question things. Think about the source. Look for evidence. That's what critical thinking is all about. And it's more important than ever these days.
It's so easy to get manipulated, especially online. But staying informed isn't just about reading articles and listening to podcasts, right? Like, we got to engage with our communities, too. Have real conversations with people.
Absolutely. It's about getting out of those online bubbles, those echo chambers, and actually connecting with people face to face.
Yeah.
And, sometimes that means having tough conversations, but that's how we grow, how we learn.
And let's not forget about voting. Getting involved in the political process, whatever that looks like for you. It's easy to feel powerless, like nothing we do matters. But it does. Every voice counts.
So true. But, all this news and information, it can be exhausting. So it's important to find ways to stay grounded, too. Don't let the negativity consume you.
That's where humor comes in, right?
Yeah.
You got to be able to laugh at the absurdity of it all, even when things feel kind of dark.
Absolutely. Humor is like a pressure valve.
Yeah.
It helps us cope. It brings us together.
And sometimes, it's just about finding that little spark of joy in the everyday chaos.
Well said. So, to wrap things up, as you go out there and face the world, remember, Be curious, think critically, be skeptical, and don't lose that sense of humor.
It's like that old saying, right? Laughter is the best medicine. Except maybe for that new suturine stuff. That sounds pretty good, too.
You got that right. All right, everyone, that's a wrap for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.
See ya.